By January 1945, the Eastern Front had become the largest theater of war in human history. To end the conflict, the Red Army needed to cross the vast frozen stretch from the Vistula River all the way to Berlin. To do it, they had amassed 4 million troops, staring down a hollowed-out German defense of barely 2 million. What followed was the inevitable output of a simple equation. The relentless industrial momentum of Soviet operational doctrine slammed into the remnants of a state that had already run out of time, fuel, and men. Yet, despite this overwhelming advantage in manpower and material, the final march to the German capital did not go smoothly. The Soviet advance inexplicably stalled, fractured across rival commanders, and eventually ground down into a highly inefficient, brutal siege. The final victory in Berlin was a collision of industrial systems, political directives from Moscow, and the tactical adaptations required for a total urban siege. For the civilians living inside Berlin at the start of the year, that approaching reality brought a pervasive sense of doom. The city was a bombed-out shell, and the millions trapped inside knew the end was imminent. A grim, fatalistic humor took hold among the population. It was said that the optimists were learning English, while the pessimists were learning Russian. Everyone knew the Red Army soldiers had watched their own motherland burn at German hands, and they were coming for revenge. The final confrontation in Berlin was a total war of annihilation, the moment where opposing societal models and industrial philosophies met their breaking point. The bedrock of combat capacity is manufacturing. The Soviets understood this, and they won by ruthlessly simplifying their engineering. Their submachine gun evolution is a perfect example. They took the complex, expensive PPD-40 from the 1930s and stripped it down into the much cheaper, stamped metal PPSH-41, and then further refined it into the folding stock PPS-43. This philosophy of structural simplification meant parts could be stamped out of sheet metal by largely unskilled labor in massive quantities. It allowed the Soviet Union to constantly increase production and reliably equip millions of troops with rugged, effective firepower. Germany, meanwhile, faced catastrophic manpower and equipment shortages. Their solution in late 1944 was the establishment of the Volkssturm. This was a people's militia scraped from the absolute bottom of the demographic barrel. Clad in rough, mismatched fabrics, it comprised young teenagers, old men, and wounded veterans from earlier campaigns. They were far more useful as a domestic propaganda tool than as a capable fighting force on the front line. To arm them, the German state mass-produced the Panzerfaust. It was cheap to manufacture in large numbers and required virtually zero training to operate. But the weapon had a fatal tactical flaw. Its range was incredibly short. To fire the armor-piercing bomb effectively, an untrained civilian had to creep from cover and get terrifyingly close to a 30-ton Soviet tank before pulling the trigger. The contrast was absolute. While the Soviets systematically industrialized their warfare to minimize complexity, the German state regressed to demanding desperate ad hoc sacrifice from its own civilians. That industrial disparity was unleashed at 5 a.m. on the 12th of January. The First Ukrainian Front initiated their offensive with a mammoth artillery barrage. The attack caught local German commanders completely off guard, as they had expected the Soviets to wait for the severe winter weather to break. By concentrating their forces at specific breakthrough sectors, the Soviets achieved a staggering numerical superiority of up to 10-1. This allowed them to execute their perfected deep battle doctrine. Once the front line was punctured, Soviet armor bypassed strongpoints and poured into the German rear, advancing an astonishing 25 to 30 miles a day. The defense was compounded by Hitler's own strategic errors. He outright refused intelligence reports detailing the buildup, denied requests to evacuate the trapped Courland pocket to shore up the lines, and inexplicably diverted the 6th SS Panzer Army south to Hungary. The German line was coming apart. By February 2nd, Soviet troops covered 500 miles, securing Oder River bridgeheads. Berlin was 40 miles away, seemingly within reach. And then, the Red Army called a halt. This sudden loss of momentum was a direct intervention from Moscow. Joseph Stalin was deeply paranoid, and he was convinced that the Soviet Union required a thick barrier of occupied buffer states in Eastern Europe to secure its borders. The Big Three Allied leaders were about to meet in Yalta to carve up the future of Europe. For Stalin, the immediate military capture of Berlin could wait. He needed to redirect his forces to secure the flanks in Silesia and Pomerania to maximize his political leverage at the negotiating table. While the military offensive paused, a severe humanitarian catastrophe was unfolding on the ground. Millions of German civilians were fleeing west, terrified of facing the same horrors the German army had previously inflicted on the Soviet Union. Simultaneously, 750,000 concentration camp prisoners were forced into death marches toward the heart of the Reich. Hundreds of thousands died from exposure, starvation, and lack of medicine in the sub-zero temperatures. The brutal reality of early 1945 was that raw military momentum was entirely subordinated to Stalin's post-war political objectives. By the beginning of April, that geopolitical calculus shifted again. The Western Allies had successfully crossed the Rhine and were rapidly advancing toward Berlin. This prompted Stalin to suddenly accelerate his timeline to capture the capital. To ensure speed, Stalin manipulated his own command structure. He effectively manufactured a race for the city by splitting the main attack vector between two rival military fronts. In the north, the First Belarusian Front was commanded by Georgy Zhukov. In the south, the First Ukrainian Front was led by Ivan Konev. For the assault on the Silo Heights, the last defensive line before Berlin, the Soviets amassed a staggering concentration of force: 2.5 million men, over 6,000 tanks, and 41,000 artillery pieces. But the initial attack on April 16th was a disaster. The German defenders accurately predicted the assault and withdrew from their first line of trenches just before the Soviet artillery barrage began, rendering the massive bombardment entirely useless. Seeking to regain the tactical advantage, Zhukov ordered the use of high-powered searchlights intended to blind the enemy. Instead, the beams bounced off the thick battlefield smoke, perfectly silhouetting the advancing Red Army troops for the German gunners. Frustrated by the delays and taunted by Stalin, Zhukov compounded the error by committing his heavy armor before a breakthrough had even been achieved. The tanks bogged down in rough, swampy ground that had been violently churned up by their own artillery craters. Despite these extreme setbacks in the north, Konev's forces executed a highly successful attack further south. This threatened to unhinge the entire German defensive position, and on the fourth day of fighting, the lines on the Silo Heights finally broke. Intense political pressure from the Kremlin forced brilliant commanders into rushed tactical blunders, costing immense and avoidable casualties. Once the Red Army breached the city limits on April 20th, the nature of the conflict changed again. The tight, rebel-choked streets of the bombed-out metropolis completely nullified the Soviet advantages in sheer numbers and open-field armor maneuvers. To avoid devastating infantry losses in slow house-to-house fighting, the Soviets adopted a brutal adaptation. They brought heavy armored artillery directly into the streets, using the guns to systematically demolish any building that housed German resistance point blank. Above ground, it was a mechanical, architectural demolition. Below ground, it was a complete psychological breakdown of reality. As Soviet shells rained down above him, Hitler became apoplectic, issuing delusional orders for phantom counterattacks by Army Detachment Steiner and the 4th Panzer Army, units that were, in truth, shattered remnants, devoid of fuel, men, and cohesion. Out on the streets, the actual defenders fought on for vastly different reasons. For ideological Nazis, there was no option but fanaticism. But for regular soldiers, every day they held out was an extra chance for civilians to escape the city, driven by a genuine, justified terror of Soviet retaliation and state-sanctioned violence. German command within the city resorted to extreme, nihilistic measures. Any civilian caught deserting was executed on the spot, and the S-Bahn underground train tunnels were deliberately blown up and flooded to deny the Soviets a pathway, drowning those sheltering inside. The tragic reality of this final defense was visible in the ranks of who was left to hold the line, with boys as young as 11 pressed into service to dig trenches and face down tanks. The urban combat devolved into a localized architectural siege of attrition, completely divorced from any rational military strategy or hope of victory. Outside the city limits, the German army was simply trying to save its own skin. The cut-off 9th Army attempted a last-ditch escape through the woods around Halbe, taking massive casualties in the process, with only a fraction managing to break through to German lines. Meanwhile, the Soviets finally completed their long-awaited link-up with American forces on the Elbe River, effectively slicing the dying Reich in two. The final timeline collapsed rapidly. Hitler took his own life on April 30th. That same evening, a Soviet banner was raised atop the ruins of the Reichstag. 2 days later, on May 2nd, the city's remaining garrison officially surrendered. The human cost of these final months is difficult to comprehend. The Soviets lost over 600,000 troops killed or missing in 1945, including 80,000 in the Battle for Berlin alone, alongside an estimated 125,000 dead civilians. For the German military, over 1 million soldiers lost their lives in 1945. More than 1 million more were marched eastward into Soviet captivity, many of whom would never return. On the 8th of May, the Second World War in Europe officially ended. The German capital was reduced entirely to rubble, the physical price of a gambled war of annihilation in the East. The overwhelming industrial mobilization and demographic mass of the Soviet state ultimately overrode any localized German tactical successes. The Battle of Berlin was a brutal, inefficient sacrifice of human life, engineered by Stalin to secure a physical geopolitical buffer. It succeeded in extinguishing Nazi hegemony forever, only to immediately set the structural stage for the Cold War.